Hello, bros. We're back with Mars without Venus. A study of some homosexual generals, which includes a large segment of theory on Napoleon. I've contacted the shipper who sent my book. I ordered this book from a bargain seller, one of those fucking, whatever you call them, discount books, thrift books. And it's been sitting in the same location for about 6 days now. I'm getting very angry about it. So I'm going with the digital version of this book. And this is chapter 1, Aspects of Homosexuality. Once upon a time, Edinburgh, Heidelberg, Leiden, and Padua were the centers of learning to which well-advised young men aspiring to become doctors of medicine would be sent. In 1921, when it was my turn, many excellent medical schools had mushroomed in the field, but Edinburgh was still acknowledged to be one of the best. The basic subjects were competently taught. Fucking competently taught. I drink one pumpkin beer and I got leprosy of the tongue. The clinical teachings in the famous Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh was second to none, and we were interested in how to conduct ourselves in medical practice and how to write an elegant prescription. Who bothers nowadays? But we received no guidance in matters which, in my chosen profession of army doctor, would come to absorb much of my interest, quite apart from their inherent interest and importance to all young undergraduates. I am referring to the facts of human sexuality and the problems to which lack of understanding of them can lead. Extramural courses in psychology were available, but I was too economical to think of asking my father to pay extra for a subject for which, as I was to learn later, he was too old-fashioned a doctor to have much respect. The Royal Army Medical College, where young doctors learned to be Army medical officers, gave us excellent instruction in all that concerns the preservation of the soldier's health and peace in war, and in the treatment of the wounds of battle. We were given no advice about how to help with the personal problems which might threaten his peace of mind, or about the wounds which the dangers of war would inflict upon his mind. It would, of course, have been unnatural for any young medical student to be quite ignorant of some of the ramifications of sexuality, even if, like myself, he had been inhibited from the early inquisitive experimentation with fellow schoolboys described by so many autobiographers. Soon after I went to my public school, which was run on the monastic lines typical of those days, there was an enormous row, and several boys were expelled for a nameless crime, for which we were darkly told they could have been sent to penal servitude. Yeah, they ain't kidding about the penal part. Penal. The headmaster, an unworldly clergyman, pontificated about it in terms calculated to make sexual neurotics of us all. Included in his comminations was a secret sin, which he actually called the sin against the Holy Ghost, which, it seemed, somehow drained an important reservoir situated behind the heart. He was, of course, talking in obscure terms, compounded of ignorance and embarrassment about masturbation and homosexual practices. Muttered gossip told of boys being found in one another's beds. At the time, I must have been too unattractive to be desired by older boys, who seemed to fall for little blondes, and too young to desire any younger one, though I can recall feeling very protective at my preparatory school towards a snivelly little creature much chased by the bullying kind of small boy. I imagine I was just enjoying being a big boy. In the upheaval, the tone of the school became inordinately high. The head of the school had been sacked to universal relief as he enjoyed beating all and sundry. A new captain was appointed, a boy of quiet charm, clearly destined for the church, as indeed he was. He was no prude. At an annual OTC camp bathing parade, the boys of other Scottish schools cast off their uniforms to reveal swimming trunks. We always swam Starko, and we wore no pants under our kilts, though that idiotic headmaster tried to make us wear them on moral grounds. The head boy was the first to throw off his kilt and lead his whooping crew of naked savages into the sea. Feminine society in those monastic schools was visible only on visiting days, and even then only as relatives. It was rather bad form to walk arm in arm with one's sister. Girlfriends were even more taboo. Non-existence of girls was reflected in boys' story books and magazines. Nowadays, it is not uncommon to see outside perfectly respectable booksellers little groups of schoolboys goggling and giggling over curvaceous nudes and girly magazines. They may well have been sent to buy the magazines by their parents, an indication of the greater openness which prevails today about sex in general. We'll go back and read this footnote. How times change. Kenneth Tynan, who incidentally refers engagingly to sexual deviation as minority hobbies, describing a school debate that the present generation has lost the ability to entertain itself, wrote, rising to make my maiden speech, I said, Mr. Chairman, as long as masturbation exists, it cannot seriously be maintained that we have lost the ability to entertain ourselves. The teacher in charge immediately closed the meeting. Today, his successor would probably be more tolerant. That is pretty funny. Writers of autobiographies tell of their adolescent experiences with the utmost frankness. If there is any social snobbery in the realm of schoolboy seduction, Beverly Nichols, with his senior prefect at Marlborough, must rank considerably lower in the pecking order than Dorian Williams, who tells the exciting story of being propositioned during his first term at Harrow by a king, but only a king of Iraq, down one peg. Yeah, I bet he was pegged. It has occasionally been suggested that boys who had not been subjected to the regime of the typical public school before so many became co-educational adapted themselves more readily to heterosexual relations, and even that such an adjustment occurs more readily among the lower social classes when boys and girls often share beds. This is probably nonsense. Not all gay Lotharios at school were after pretty little boys. There were also pretty little housemaids, though less accessible to all but the most determined. Every school had its precocious flashmen, as well as its goody-goody Tom Brown, with most of us firmly in between. As for the so-called lower classes, I can only say that as I got to know other ranks better and better, I found many of them surprisingly innocent or ignorant of sex. Now, not all the boys who were sacked from my school were homosexual, if indeed any of them were. The older ones, far from sinking out of sight, in disgrace, pursued normal careers, married, and lived happily ever after. One even became a bishop, as if that proved anything. I cannot be sure about their little friends who were not so publicly identified. I have read about and encountered in medical practice men who admitted that in their youth they had set themselves to attract older boys and men, and that they experienced masochistic pleasure from being physically used. From such individuals are recruited the male prostitutes. Those expelled from school were normal boys in a well-recognized phase of adolescence. Those left behind, especially if befrogged, or it'd be funnier if it was befrogged, if befogged by the way in which the scandal was handled, were probably more at risk. Whoa, 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 Bubba, calm down. We're more at risk of growing up with sexual repressions and misunderstandings. Blundering headmasters still exist. Peter Ustinov's stories on the subject end with a choice specimen from one headmaster's little talk. You may have noticed between your legs. The footnote. And number 2, some recent and fairly detailed studies of homosexuality are referred to in Montgomery Hyde's book, The Other Love. Since no one had taught me about psychology apart from what I had picked up from those who had attended the extramural courses at Edinburgh University, I had to learn it for myself. This is essential knowledge for every doctor and for every leader of men. It is not necessary to attempt to understand fully the theories of the founding fathers, Freud, Jung, and Adler, since Jung himself, perhaps the most profound thinker of the three, wrote, "Modern psychology is the testimony of a few individuals here and there regarding what they have found within themselves." A modern authority wrote, "Many of the concepts laboriously formulated by psychoanalysts are really matters of common observation put into technical language. Nonetheless, guidance from those who pioneered the fascinating territory of man's unconscious mind can obviously be helpful. I have found Alfred Adler the easiest guide to follow, and I have recommended and explained his teachings to Army officers for many years and briefly outlined them in 2 of my books, Napoleon, Bisexual Emperor, and Fighting Spirit, 1978. Adler taught that the integrated personality, the normal happy man, pardon my chair adjustment, must be adjusted to 3 great demands of life: society, occupation, and sex. A better way of putting this is to say that one must be adjusted to social life, to one's job, and to love, since love tends to be overlooked nowadays in the general preoccupation with sex. Sinclair Lewis's opinion, quoted in Appendix 1, Paragraph 5, is worth recalling. He was writing at a time when social scientists and such people had not thought of coldly referring to a loving couple as a pair bond. Not surprisingly, it fell most frequently to an army doctor to have to deal with failure to adapt to sex. The many ways in which such failure may be manifested need not be described. They are as diverse as human nature itself, which is fascinatingly and excitingly varied. By no means all of my patients were troubled by homosexual feelings, though for the purposes of this book I concentrate upon those who were. Growing experience helped me to spot young men who might need advice, though this was a little like the ardent youth who propositioned almost every girl he met. "But don't you often get rebuffed?" he was asked. "Oh yes, but you'd be surprised how often I score." Little harm was done if the soldier said he was not in need of advice, but such approaches to officers among whom one was living were clearly impossible. The subsequent histories of 1 or 2 friends made me regret that I had felt unwilling or unable to offer a helping hand. I soon learned that a doctor must take an interest in a patient's whole life and his attitude to life rather than just in his present illness. This also helps to establish a sympathetic relationship with him. An experienced physician recently wrote, "Neurotic complaints are common among strong, vigorous, active young men. They are more full of fads than many would suspect." British Medical Journal, 20th December 1980, page 1717. Young soldiers are no exception. To convince a light infantry captain that he did not have high blood pressure, I once had to buy for myself the instrument with which regimental doctors were not then provided to carry out the necessary test. He subsequently played squash with me daily throughout an Indian hot weather. At about the hour when Englishmen traditionally cavort with mad dogs, but the most usual source of neurosis among my soldier patients was worrying about some perfectly normal aspect of their sexuality, an important cause of human suffering with which my medical education had not prepared me to cope. Stress and anxiety arising from maladjustment to sexual life is a fairly common underlying cause of emotional illness among married or unmarried patients. This was especially true in my early days as an army doctor in India. Many more men in the army were unmarried than today, and particularly for the rank and file, female society was very limited. A young soldier's ingrowing sex was more important than his ingrowing toenails, and much more interesting. Not being formally trained in psychology, I did not delve as deeply as a psychiatrist might have done, still less use hypnosis. Simple questioning and conversation usually gave answers which satisfied me and my patient and enabled me to help him. This sort of thing illustrates the truth of the saying, confession is good for the soul, but I always insisted that confession was not the right word. The doctor must assume the role of deus ex machina, or superior know-all, but appear as a fellow human being beset by similar strains and temptations. The doctor must not assume those roles, engaged in mutual exploration, as it were. I seldom use dream analysis, which I felt may often tell the analyst what he wants to hear rather than what the unconscious mind wants to tell him. Let me give a superb example from my own experience. Shortly before my 21st birthday, I dreamed frequently about bagpipes. Sometimes the drones were of rubber and drooped lifelessly over my shoulder. Never could music be conjured from the wretched instrument. With malicious intent, but an apparently innocent desire for advice, I confided my dreams to a budding analyst. Bagpipes, what joy, no less than 5 phallic symbols united in a bag of skin. I was, he feared, in a serious state of sexual frustration. But could it not, I meekly asked, have something to do with my father's promise of a magnificent bagpipe mounted in silver and ivory, which occupied all my waking thoughts? Ah, wish fulfillment dream, how disappointing. In dreams, the unconscious mind talks to us in symbolic language, and the kind of dream which can help may be quite short, but vivid and clearly remembered on waking, when it should be written down in unconnected scenes and snatches, just as it occurred before the conscious mind can get to work to join it into a logical sequence by secondary elaboration. One simple example will serve to show that all cases were not concerned with abnormal desires. A young lance bombardier suffered from severe headaches, anxiety, and insomnia. He feared sleep because of a recurring nightmare in which he was wrestling with a giant ape, and although concerned to save his life, he felt strangely averse to killing the ape. The conflict of emotions awoke him in terror. It transpired that this young soldier, since coming to India, had had frequent intercourse with prostitutes, a line of conduct diametrically opposed to his strict upbringing by a stern and moralistic father whom he loved and feared. Asked what his father would say if he learned about his son's conduct in India, he replied, I think he'd come to India and kill me. We easily agreed that the ape symbolized his father, who in fact need never hear about the life being lived by his wayward son, who was old enough to decide how to lead his sexual life. I advised him to avoid the threats to health associated with such a life, but also stressed my own view that premarital continence was a good thing as a preparation for a happy married life. His headaches and nightmares were ended, and in one last dream he witnessed the death of the ape with feelings of mingled sadness and affection. Why did you kill the fucking ape? Why don't you just stop banging whores? I mean, wouldn't that have been easier? I mean, your father, he wasn't banging the whores. Maybe he was, but you were banging whores and you had to kill dad because you were a fucking whoremonger? Come on. Be better than that. I often wonder if my patient invented that dream to please me. It is often a case of fitting the interpretation of dreams to suit the analyst's preconceived ideas. Modern research confirms that dreams have a valuable function in human experience, just as primitive tribes instinctively believe. Robert Graves, in his book The Meaning of Dreams, 1924, stated his belief that dreams have a value in themselves. Another plainly heterosexual patient had many vague symptoms and was worrying himself to death, as the saying has it. He proved to have been masturbating a lot. I almost wrote excessively, but remembered that modern writers have said that it is not possible to decide what constitutes excess in this practice. He had written to his fiancée breaking off his engagement, for he thought he had rendered himself unworthy of her, indeed permanently unfit for marriage. He must have been influenced by some well-meaning ass like my headmaster. This soldier was himself very stupid, and to jolt him into accepting an opposite view, I said, "You mean to tell me you've been doing this 3 times a day and all..." Let's start that again. I said, "You mean to tell me you've been doing this 3 times a day all through this Indian hot weather and think you're unfit for marriage? My dear chap, you're the answer to the maiden's prayer." Now, here I was following a line which I knew had been preached by one of the extramural teachers to whom I referred. He used to say, "I advise my patients to masturbate until they're blue in the face." This I never accepted as good or proper counseling. In words suited to his intelligence, I advised my troubled soldier on the lines summarized in paragraphs 27 to 32 of Appendix 1. The pamphlet in which these words were included was written in 1955, when I was a brigadier and the head doctor of the 1st British Corps in Germany. At the time, it was considered to be helpful and reasonably outspoken. References to masturbation were then seldom to be seen in print, except in medical textbooks. In one of these, Otto Fenichel defined it as playing with one's own genitals for the purpose of gaining pleasure. Most of the book about what came to be called sexology was written in German. Havelock Ellis, a pioneer in the English language, largely directed his attention to female masturbation. Smart man, possibly because most of his readers were likely to be men, many of whom were probably ignorant of its existence in the opposite sex. All recent authorities unite in insisting that it is a normal facet of sexuality. They condemn the custom of frightening children and adolescents with fictions about its supposed ill effects, from pimples and dark shadows under the eyes to insanity. Desmond Morris, in Intimate Behavior, Jonathan Cape, 1971, noted that in a popular magazine, women were advised to masturbate to your heart's content, but he feels very rightly that if we are all to be advised on such lines, the pendulum may have swung too far, even if it is healthier. It should be an healthier attitude than the old secrecy and repression. Such dire warnings, reinforced by ill-informed gossip, sowing fears that signs of overindulgence are visible in the body, have driven youths to suicide. I've known of such sad deaths. The modern use of the term self-stimulation in preference to self-abuse reflects the saner modern attitude. Writers of many autobiographies, the latest to come to my notice being that of Edward Blishen, have described their early experiences of the practice, and references to it are made in newspapers and on television. All this would have been unthinkable some 50, even 25 years ago. In former days, not only ignorant schoolmasters, but even doctors scared the young with warnings of its evil effects, without attempting to explain why such disastrous physical effects did not also follow normal intercourse, of which the effects upon the body are precisely the same. There were many doctors who genuinely believed that masturbation led to insanity, an erroneous belief probably arising from the unashamed promiscuity with which patients in the old-style lunatics indulged in it. John Hunter, 1728 to 1793, was one of the first, if not indeed the very first, to shine a beam of common sense into the dark depths of ignorance, and to do so in 1786 was truly bold, for the medical profession was then united in attributing every sort of evil to this dreadful sin. Hunter, that great Scotsman and friend of Joseph Haydn, was for a time Surgeon General of the Army, a man in whose footsteps, however belatedly, a Scots army doctor may be proud to tread. I am indebted to Sir Derek Dunlop for an interesting sidelight on the Victorian attitude to masturbation. Referring to the earliest use of bromide in medical treatment, he writes, "This was introduced in 1856 by one of Queen Victoria's physicians, Sir Charles Locock, for the prevention of juvenile epilepsy, because it was a well-known aphrodisiac, and masturbation was then regarded as a potent etiological causal factor in juvenile epilepsy, a threat which caused the gravest concern to generations of Victorian schoolboys." Whilst writing my pamphlet, I had many private talks with soldiers singly or in small groups, and was surprised, even a little shocked, to learn how openly, even boastfully, masturbation was performed in some barrack rooms. Though I had to admit that openness could be less harmful than secretiveness, when soldiers resorted to the latrine, intensifying the sense of shame and defilement, masturbation guilt, as the psychiatrists call it, when dealing with young soldiers, I found that misapprehension about the fancied ill effects of this normal element of sexuality led to much anxiety and tension. This may be so, but surely to a lesser extent because it is more openly mentioned. Reassurance about the absence of physical damage may be reinforced by pointing out how profusely nature overinsures for the survival of all species. The seeds of flowers and plants, hundreds of eggs laid by the female turtle for every baby that makes it to the sea. The human testicle, one is a necessity, two a luxury, generates enough seed to outlast a lifetime of overindulgence in sexual intercourse, of which masturbation is but a pale shadow. Wilhelm Steckel roundly condemned the wickedness of doctors who let boys imagine that something in the appearance of their genital organs had pointed to this sort of indulgence. It cannot be too strongly stressed that there is nothing whatever unusual in the appearance of one who is overindulging in the habit. I found that some patients needed much reassurance about this, presumably because silly schoolboy jokes and taunts persist into adult life. I am sure I am not alone in having overheard sarcastic drill sergeants bawling at a weedy recruit. "You couldn't knock the skin off a rice pudding. You want to keep your hands outside the blankets." Little wonder that my rather unintelligent patient thought himself unfitted for marriage, and he was only one of many who suffered from masturbation guilt in various forms. Some believed that their external genital organs were undersized or impaired in some way, and it was of them that I was thinking when I wrote in my first book about Napoleon. By a happy chance, a sample of the quiet sense of fun of Mr. Maurice Wigan, the television critic of the Sunday Times, has a distinct bearing on Napoleon's sexual difficulties. 92% of all men worry that their penises are too small, said an American sociologist, psychologist, and man alive's piece, The Naked Ego. Not 93%, nor 91%, as you used to believe in your happy-go-lucky way. I do love the categorical precision of these holy stumblebums who go around catechizing representative samples of the hapless population and cross-fertilizing their statistics to produce ever more garish blossoms of wisdom and delight. And with that, we shall end, bruv, for now. Goodbye. Goodbye, bros. Goodbye.